Obsolete 2, The Triplet. Written by DaviZedo2. Thomas was in a bad mood. Toby wasn't feeling well, so the Fat Controller had asked Thomas to go to the quarry and fetch his trucks instead of pulling his normal passenger train. As he grumbled into the quarry, he met Mavis, shunting his trucks together.
"Hello, Thomas," smiled Mavis. "Haven't seen much of you lately."
"Hello," Thomas said bluntly. Mavis chuckled.
"Good to see you're in high spirits,"
she teased. Thomas let off steam crossly. Then he looked to the far side of the quarry, and was surprised to see one of the Ironworks twins shunting some trucks under the chute. "What," Thomas began sternly, "is he doing here?" Mavis looked over.
"Oh, you mean Harry? He and his brother Bert like to come over from time to time and help me out."
"Whatever for?" asked Thomas crossly. He did not like the idea of the two Diesels being on his branch line.
"I don't really know," admitted Mavis. "They just showed up one day and wouldn't leave until the manager came over here, shouting at them to get back to their jobs. It's been going on for years now, to be honest. They show up, their manager comes over and yells profanities at them, then they leave, then they're back within a few months."
Thomas just sniffed. Maybe their guilt's finally come back to haunt them. He then turned his attention to Harry. "I see you over there," he shouted. "You can't hide who you really are from me." Harry just grunted and went back to work. Mavis sighed.
"I think something is going on with them two, to be honest, but they won't tell me. I think maybe their manager's abusive or something. I don't really know."
Thomas didn't really know what to say to that, so chose to say nothing. When his train was ready, he puffed away back up the line, pondering to himself. "I wonder what's going on with them," he thought. "They normally can't get enough of their work." What had been going on with Harry and Bert had been rather difficult for the two twins to cope with. A few years ago, their owner made a deal with British Railways to start scrapping and melting down diesel engines. Diesels, who had once considered themselves superior and better than steam, were now in the same boat. They were being lined up and scrapped, while a newer technology took their place. The entire situation had completely shattered the twins' worldview. They were now less hostile to the steam engines, but just as grumpy. To get away from all the despair and death, the two Diesels had been sneaking off to various places on the island every few months or so, and would hide out there. Their manager had gotten increasingly annoyed at this, and had to keep on borrowing Splasher and Dodge to keep the workload flowing. Unlike Harry and Bert, the two didn't really seem to care much for their grim job. "Isn't it strange how we take all these Diesels into that shed and they never come out again?"
"That's because they're dead, Splatter."
"Oh." However, it had gotten to the point where the manager couldn't keep them around forever. What he needed was a third engine to himself, one that would actually obey his demands and do the work without fuss. He had been looking around for a while, trying to find a small diesel shunter for cheap. It wasn't long until he found one. The smelter's manager arrived at an old quarry. The quarry was dull and dreary. Crows flew around the old, dilapidated buildings. The only sound was a grubby diesel shunter rumbling around the complex. She shot the manager a dirty look as she rolled by. The manager gulped uncomfortably. Just then, he heard a loud voice cut through the quiet quarry behind him. "Hello there!" The manager jumped and turned around in surprise, only to see a thin man wearing a hard hat. It was clear that this was the quarry foreman, the man he'd spoken to over the phone. "Alright," replied the gruff man. "I'm the guy here to see the engine of yours."
"All right, I had a feeling that you were him," replied the foreman in a rather excitable tone.
"Step right this way, please." The quarry foreman led the smelter's manager towards an old work shed. The bricks were cracked, and the roof had several holes in. "Now," the foreman began, I will warn you, he does have a few bits and pieces missing. But you want a scrapyard, right? His parts can easily be replaced. The manager thought that could be possible. Depends on his state, really. Well, I hope he meets your standards, smiled the foreman as he opened the shed doors. The doors creaked slowly, and the two men entered the dark building. The shed was dark. The only light in the small shack came through the holes in the roof. The manager looked upwards and stepped back in surprise. Hanging from a hoist on the shed roof was a diesel engine. He was shaped a lot like Harry and Bert, but many of his parts were different or completely removed. What stuck out to the manager most was the diesel's face. He had a massive crack running down his forehead towards his left cheek. His left eye was completely white and almost seemed to glow in the darkness, while his right eye looked tired and full of despair. He gave the manager a cold, grim look. It was enough to make the rather hard man feel very uncomfortable. This here is old Clive, the foreman began. He's an older design, and we don't really have a use for him anymore. Been using his parts for old Betsy out there for as long as I can remember. He needs a new home, a place where he can be taken care of. The manager looked at the old diesel shunter, then sniffed. He's in very rough shape. Oh, come on. I know you have seen a lot of rusty engines in your time, but I assure you, old Clive has got some fat left in him. The foreman smiled. With some new parts and paint, he should be as fit as a fiddle. The manager sighed. He wasn't impressed with the state of the diesel at all. And besides, the look the engine was giving him was making him feel very uncomfortable. But on the other hand, it was a cheap engine, and he had plenty of parts he could easily salvage from the old diesels on the sidings. So reluctantly, the manager agreed to buy him. The foreman shook his hand excitedly. Oh, thank you, mister, he beamed. You will not regret this. I hope not, the manager muttered darkly. As the two left the shed and headed towards the foreman's office, the smelter's manager turned around one last time to look at the engine. The diesel just gazed at him, but said nothing. The manager shook his head and walked out of the workshop. A couple of months later, Harry and Bert were ordered into the yards. The twins looked around at the rusting, angry diesels about the place. Their cold stares of judgment and hatred made them shudder. Ugh, I don't like this place anymore, muttered Harry. Bert, who was normally a lot less chatty out of the two, didn't say anything. Suddenly, the two of them heard an unfamiliar engine. It didn't sound right, however, as the twins could hear it splutter and backfire as it came towards them. Soon, the shape of an engine came into view. The twins stared in shock as another diesel shunter came rolling in. It was painted in the same colours as them and had a very similar shape. However, a few of its parts appeared to be missing or had been replaced awkwardly. What really stuck out was the poor attempt at trying to repair the engine's face. A large scar ran down it, with bolts crudely holding it together. The expression of the diesel was cold and stern. The manager stepped out of the cab and walked towards the two twins. "I'm Harry, I'm Bert," he began. "Seeing how piss poor your work has been recently, I've got another engine to help you. This is, I'm Clive." The three diesels just looked at each other. Harry and Bert immediately got an uneasy vibe from the newcomer, who simply stared at them with a disapproving look. Alright, said Harry at last. Clive, however, didn't say anything. He just stared. "Right," announced the manager, clapping his hands together. "Time to get back to work. Maybe with another engine round here, we can finally get things done correctly." "Yeah," muttered Bert darkly. The manager walked away, leaving the three diesels alone in a rather awkward silence. "So, Guess we must teach you the ropes then, asked Harry. But to their surprise, Clive simply started up his engine and rolled away, blowing smoke at the two engines as he went past. It made the twins cough and splutter. What the? Choked Harry. I was only trying to help. What an arsehole, muttered Bert. Clive simply got stuck right in. Well, he didn't really know what he was doing, his driver did, and so Clive learnt rather quickly by simply rolling around the complex and doing his work. All the while, he ignored the two Ironworks twins. Clive was in the special refinery shed where steel gets repurposed and used again. Harry rolled over. Got any questions about our equipment? He asked. Clive just snorted and rolled away with his trucks of fresh steel. This made Harry rather cross. Dickhead, he muttered. Later, Clive was in the main smelting shed, pushing an old, rusty shunting diesel towards the grabber. The shunter groaned and cried as he was roughly forced into the shed. I can still be used, he protested. Please, just let someone else come in and buy me. Clive didn't listen. He simply shunted the diesel under the grabber. At that point, Bert quickly came rushing in. Wait, Clive, he said. It's mandatory that before we scrap an engine, we let them have a moment of silence. Clive stared at Bert. Then, for the first time all day, Clive did something other than display that deadpan face. He smirked, a wicked smile. It was almost just as intimidating as his resting face. It sent shivers right through Bert's radiator, but Bert didn't have any time to process this. Clive let out a loud blast of his horn, alerting the grabber operators that the scrap was ready. No, please, no. And still smiling, Clive slowly rolled out of the smelting shed as the little diesel was crushed by the grabber and his metal was burnt away inside of the pit. Bert sat there, staring off into the distance. Clive hadn't listened to him, and worse still, he had shown genuine satisfaction in taking the life of that little diesel shunter. It made Bert think about his own behaviour in the past, back when he used to do the same with steam engines. He suddenly felt rather ill. That night, Harry and Bert were in their shed. They were talking about Clive. I don't like him, Harry said bluntly. He's weird, too quiet. Bert didn't say anything. He just looked down at his buffers. Harry noticed this and spoke up. You're being more quiet than usual. You alright? Bert faltered. I saw him scrapping a diesel earlier. And? Asked Harry. Didn't even give him a moment of silence or nothing, said Bert. He enjoyed it. He enjoyed taking away that that engine's life. Bert then looked over towards his brother. We are no better. Harry said nothing. He knew exactly what his brother was talking about. We scrapped so many steam engines back in the day, Bert continued. We were just like him. We enjoyed it. We never viewed those engines as individuals. We just saw them as metal and bolts. But at the end of the day, that's exactly what we are as well. Even though Harry knew exactly where Bert was going, hearing it still hit him. He felt his sins crawl through his radiator, his guilt weighing heavily on top of him. We're fools, Harry muttered darkly. Those engines, those steam engines, they didn't really deserve what we put them through. At that time, we thought that we were just making way for the future by getting rid of what we thought was useless. But in the end, we were really just bringing our own kind closer to the cutter's torch. Poetic, is it not? A voice cut through the darkness of the eerie ironworks. Harry and Bert looked up in surprise. Then they saw it, the misshapen diesel engine, rolling towards them. He stopped, a sly grin on his face. His blind eye almost seemed to twinkle in the darkness. An awkward silence followed, until Ari found his voice. "So, you do speak," Clive chuckled, before looking at the Iron Twins with a wide grin. A grin of pure malice. "You two are just typical," he said slyly. "Little boys who thought they knew everything, thinking that they were better than everyone else, because they were new or modern. But nothing stays new and modern forever, does it now?" Yeah, grunted Harry. "We know that. It's all around us. We realised that a while ago." Snorted Clive. "Don't try and take the moral high ground with me now. I know exactly what kind of engines you are. Pathetic and feeble. Though it's not just you. It's everyone in this damned place. You all acted like you were the best, and for everyone else who didn't fit into your flawed ideals to one side. You all are idiots. I learnt things the hard way a long time ago." Ari and Bert shuddered. The sheer malice and hatred in Clive's voice made them uneasy. However, something was on both of their minds. What happened to you?" Bert asked curiously. Clive looked almost surprised at the question. He looked down at the rails for a moment, seemingly debating if he should tell the two Diesels his story. But then once again, he smiled and began his tale. "Long ago, I worked happily with my brothers. We were close, we were happy, and we were the most modern and up-to-date diesel shunters around. We had so much promise and so much life in us. But it was all thrown away. The directors at the time considered us to be non-standard and not suitable for their needs. Even though we had so much left to give, we were withdrawn. I watched my brothers be scrapped. I watched as the life left their eyes and they were reduced to nothing but jagged pieces of metal. Then they came for me. However, I ended up being spared. I was brought by some quarry. I thought maybe it was a second chance for me. Alas, it proved to be a fate worse than scrap. I was cannibalized, my parts taken away to repair the other diesel engine working there. I lost so much of myself, bits and pieces that I can never get back. Even when your manager brought me and tried to fix me, these pieces, they aren't mine. I am not me." Clive started to breathe heavily. Ari and Bert said nothing. They felt scared by this engine, whose mind had seemed to have left it long ago. Clive soon recovered and gave them another twisted smirk. None of them deserved to stand so long. The end is here for all of them, and I will take great satisfaction in wiping them from this world. It's what they deserve after all, for everything that they put me through. And soon, I shall make sure that the same happens to you when the time comes. Your end is fast approaching." And on that disturbing note, Clive rolled away into the darkness, his blind eye growing into the mist as he soon disappeared from sight. Ari and Bert stared at each other. They didn't say anything. What was there to even say? It took a long time, but eventually, the two Diesels fell asleep. Their sleep was not pleasant, however. It was full of nightmares, of both steam engines and diesel engines being cut up with blow torches, crushed by mechanical claws, and lowered down into smelting pits. Their screams filled the area. The smell of molten metal and slag hung in the air like thick fog. How could they have ever enjoyed this work? How could they have been so happy in ending the lives of others for so long? How did they not realise that they were no different from their steam counterparts? How could they just sit there and let all of this continue to carry on? By the early hours of the morning, both Diesels were awake, haunted and tortured from their guilt. "So," Harry began, "the quarry?" Bert simply murmured in agreement.